We are live.
Hey,
Hey.
calling Chris Anderson in London.
Good guess. Yes, Chris
I am.
Anderson,
Great.
London. And calling Rick Beyer in.
New York City.
Holy cow, you get around.
I know. There's a big park right out there,
Oh.
and it's very centrally located. And so
Wow.
I think you can expect a full panoply of sound today. Police sirens, children, subways. It's going to be, crime victims. I don't know. It's going to be crazo here.
Crazo. Ooh,
Yeah.
slang. Is
So
that some of
James
that cool
Stark, James Stark asks a question. He says, "Are you guys still on the continent?" So I'm on a continent. How
As
about
am
you?
I.
Are you on a
As am I.
continent?
Well, I'm at the center of the universe.
You are just off of a continent.
Yes, we are. We consider ourselves our own little continent.
Okay. Well, I want to welcome everyone to History Happy Hour, brought to you with the help of Stephen Ambrose Historical Tours. And Chris and I do travel the globe, and we actually were together last week, but we still managed to be here Sundays to have a cocktail and talk history to you. And today we'll be talking about the ghost of Ben Franklin.
Holy cow!
I know. So
Slip
you
that
don't
one
have
in
to
there.
drink there. No drinking, Chris. Yeah.
No.
Chris,
The
who's with
Ghost
us?
Army will come up anyway, though.
Oh, okay. So
Take
there we
that
go.
guy.
So who's with us today?
Well, Nancy says that Houston is in the house, so we're glad for that. John
Nice.
Matthew, Doreen's joining us again, and Marilyn. Marilyn, who's Marilyn?
I don't know. She's a friend of Lizzie Borden's, I think.
Oh, okay, good. That's good.
And I do just want to say before we start the show that we were together with two other great historians last week, both on the show and in person. I guess like 10 days ago.
Yeah.
Hugh McDonald Buchanan and Matt Brogy, and what a great trip that was
It really
in
was.
Normandy with
It
those
was.
guys and with the wonderful guests who came along as well.
Yeah, no, it was a super time. The master class was great. We all learned from each other, which was wonderful. The weather could have been a scotch better, but the Omaha beach day was perfect, so it was
I
great.
know it looks good. This picture looks like it was taken in a studio backdrop of Omaha Beach, but it is actually on Omaha Beach. So it was truly a wonderful trip. Well, Chris, we are building an audience here, so I think we're close enough to get going. So do you want to give us a cue to get started?
Okay. The bar is open.
The bar is open. And Chris, before we get to Ben Franklin, we have another new book we're going to talk about just briefly. You want to
Yeah.
take us into that?
Well, it just showed up in the mail for me today. It's a book called The American Revolution, and it's written by my nephew, my 9-year-old nephew, Maxwell Lyons, and this is his first book, and was really proud of it, and I wanted to congratulate him on putting that together. And this is our young author right here, musical as well. Takes after not
So
me.
he could set this book to a stage show for Broadway. a
Look out
musical.
Hamilton! Look out
I
Hamilton!
know, right? And does he? I hope he has a correct understanding of the revolution and who wins the revolution and the causes
Well,
of it, etc.
I want to say that Uncle Chris is working on that. There's some work that needs to be done, but he does correctly point out that the American War of Independence was a civil war, and so Uncle Chris was very proud of that. So I wanted to say good job, Max.
Well, Max, we all congratulate you, and I'm sure everybody
Yeah.
in our audience will give a shout out to Max, and so you check that out. And a few years down the line, maybe when you've revised this book or written the next one, Max, we will try to get you on the show.
Yes,
But-
that'd be great.
But today we're going to talk about another a founding father, Ben Franklin, and we all know Ben Franklin, Poor Richard's Almanac, Ambassador to France, a republic if you can keep it, the $100 bill, that guy. And he's our topic today, but not so much his life, Chris, as his afterlife, which does make the show sound kind of like a seance. And if that's the case, our spiritual advisor today is Michael Meyer, who is the author of a terrific new book called Benjamin Franklin's Last Bet, The Favorite Founder's Divisive Death, Enduring Afterlife, and Blueprint for American Prosperity. And Michael is the author of 3 acclaimed books, numerous articles for the New York Times, and he is an English professor at the University of Pittsburgh, where he teaches creative writing. And he joins us from Taipei.
Believe it or not.
Taipei.
Yes.
What time is it in Taipei, Michael?
It's 4:04 in the morning. So Maxwell Lyons, congratulations on your new book, and this is
Thank
the
you.
glorious future. That'll
Is
wait.
this-
Glamorous life as a writer.
Can you write a recommendation for him to the University of Pittsburgh if he needs it?
Happy
Will you
to
guarantee that here on History Happy Hour?
I'll provide a blurb. Send me a copy.
So Mike, I just want to know that so you're there teaching, right?
I'm here as a Fulbright scholar. I'm teaching nonfiction writing, which is really interesting because there isn't really a tradition of nonfiction in Asia. There are no MFA programs in Asian universities. And so I'm here teaching college students to write about their lives and about their hometowns. And I'm also researching a biography of the island.
So, but we got you up at like 3 o'clock in the morning. So you could be honest. So does that mean in class tomorrow you're just going to put on a movie?
I have class at 10. So I have class in 6 hours. And the big debate in my mind is, do I go back to bed or do I push through it? So I'll probably
I think it's sit in the easy chair with your head back and just do a little napping, light napping. That's where I go with this.
Paint the eyebrow. Paint the eyebrows. Yeah.
Well, you're in Taipei. You have an enduring interest in China, reflected in some of your earlier writings, and oddly enough, China has something to do with how you come face to face with the story of Ben Franklin in a way that changes your life. So let's start there.
That's a great throw. Thank you for that, Rick. Hey, because I was one of the first Peace Corps volunteers to China in 1995, and I spent over a decade in China writing books and working as a correspondent. And then when I came back to the States, I was invited to the state luncheon for then President Hu Jintao at our State Department. And I had never been to a thing like this, a soiree. And so I bought my first suit off a clearance rack at Macy's. I took the train down to DC. I stepped into the State Department and, I felt completely out of place. The diplomatic reception rooms are gorgeous. It's, honey-colored herringbone wood floors and Chippendale sofas and Paul Revere silver. And I saw Barbara Streisand talking to Colin Powell, and Yo-Yo Ma was playing his cello. And I thought, this isn't for me. And I stepped into a side room to sort of collect myself. And I put my hand on a piece of furniture, and a voice behind me said, "Please don't touch that." And I flinched and said, "Oh, I'm sorry. Is it old?" And it was a Marine guard standing behind me. And he said, "That's the table where Benjamin Franklin signed the Treaty of Paris." And I had that embarrassing moment first where I thought, I didn't know Franklin did that. And number two, what's the Treaty of Paris again? And so this Marine guard and I started chatting, and he was really a Franklin enthusiast. We were in the Franklin reception, the diplomatic reception room. The Franklin was, he was the father of the Foreign Service. And he started telling me all these Franklin facts. And later that day, when I got back to the hotel, I did what one does. I started Googling. And Googling Franklin led me to realize that, not only did he invent all these things that you mentioned in the introduction, and he charted the Gulf Stream and talked about the Northern Lights and had perfected the catheter and the odometer, that he also left this amazing last will and testament, which I read through. And it's time to write a book when the book you want to read doesn't exist. And I thought, how has no one told the story of Franklin's amazing will before? And that led me on this 10-year journey to this book.
There we go. So Michael, I mean, one of the things, so in a nutshell, without way too much math, because Rick and I are both historians and the math gets confusing, what is what's in the will? What is the thing that you said, wow, this is something?
So the first thing that caught my eye is he left to his grandson his Chinese gong. And so the connection there with my luncheon was too perfect. So I started thinking, what in the world is a Chinese gong? And it turns out that Thomas Jefferson also admired this Chinese gong. And you can visit a replica at Monticello. The big clock when you walk in the doorway at Monticello has this Chinese gong that still bongs the hour. But Franklin's will is real. All wills are interesting, right? They all tell a story of a life. And Franklin's, I realized, he knew it would be published. And so the first series of bequests are just score settling and value leaving onto descendants. Every gift comes with a lesson attached. But then I got to his codicil, or codicil, depending on which side of the Atlantic you're on. And in this, he lays out this last bet where he takes a sum of money. It's a lot of money. It's hard to do historical equivalencies with money, but it's 1,000 pounds that go into a pot for Boston and 1,000 pounds that go into a pot for Philadelphia. And he essentially invents microfinance. I mean, Franklin says, I want this money to be used to create small loans for apprentices who want to start their own businesses. I want to stake them for a period of 10 years. They'll pay it back at a very low interest rate, below market. It was 5%. And as they pay it back, the principal of this money will accrue and get larger. The miracle of compound interest will mean that after 100 years, there'll be a vast sum of money. I want Boston and Philly to come together democratically and for each city to decide how to spend the money to benefit the common good. I want some of the money to go back into circulation for loans to tradespeople. And then on the bicentennial on my death, I want you to both come together again. And we're going to have a jackpot, this windfall. And you're going to build something astounding to benefit the common good in each of my hometowns.
So, okay, go ahead.
Go ahead, Chris.
I was going to follow up. And was when he did this, I had never heard of it. I mean, at the time, was it something radical or
yeah.
That's because that was going to be my question too.
Okay,
which is
sorry.
no, don't be, because we're both brilliant Franklin scholars. So of course we come to the same question. Is this something that this is also what his fellow founders are doing, or is this some sort of Ben Franklin original?
This is the Ben Franklin original with a twist. Most of Franklin's greatest sayings, as Poor Richard, were borrowed from other people. And he admits this in the last edition of Poor Richard's Almanac. I hope you've enjoyed all my sayings. I took the best ones from other sources. And you find that quite a bit, actually. A lot of Franklin's philanthropy, early on in Philadelphia, he borrowed from Daniel Defoe. Defoe, long before he wrote Robinson Crusoe, was on the run from creditors, holed up in Bristol, and wrote a book called Essays on Projects, where he lays out things like a pension scheme for widows, a firefighting brigade, fire insurance, and so forth. And Franklin admits this later on in his life, that a lot of his great ideas were borrowed from other people. So if we go ahead a little bit in his life to 1785, he's 79 years old, and he's living in Paris as the minister from the United States to France. He's about ready to leave Paris and go back to Philadelphia, and the Constitutional Convention is going to kick off. And Franklin receives an essay from an admirer, a man named Charles Joseph Mathon de la Cour of the court. And la Cour, instead of writing Poor Richard, he writes about a man called Fortunate Richard. And Fortunate Richard wants to show the world the miracle of compound interest. This is very much aimed at Franklin's eyes to sort of impress his hero. And in this essay, this man named Fortunate Richard receives a sum of money from his grandfather, is told to put it in an account and let it mature for 100 years. Somehow in the essay, Fortunate Richard survives those 100 years. And then he decides, I'm going to take that money and put it in my will and use it to fund projects. Now, projects was the noun that Franklin used most in his memoir and his autobiography. People actually counted the words that Franklin uses. He loved the word projects. You can imagine Franklin reading this essay going, ooh, a project, I'm in. And in this essay, Fortunate Richard funds things like trade school for women so they can learn a trade and earn equal pay with men. Universal income for newborn children so their parents can afford childcare. A Central European Bank, the precursor of the euro, so European nations will no longer be at war with one another. Libraries. And then finally, he funds this trade scheme where he says, look, I want to put money away so apprentices can fund their own businesses. Franklin reads this, loves it, sends it to his friend Richard Price in England. Price translates it, sticks it in the back of a pamphlet about the American Revolution, and it's completely forgotten. 4 years later, Franklin is in Philadelphia. He's gone through the rigors of the Constitutional Convention. He sees Philadelphia has changed beyond recognition. He worries about the aristocracy that's coming to rule the United States. And so he says, I'm going to dust off this great essay about Fortunate Richard. I'm going to stick it in my will. And so it's completely novel. It's very different than what the other founders and other people were doing with their money at that time. But at the same time, it's very much borrowed from another man's idea. And Franklin even writes Charles Joseph Mathon de la Cour and says, look, you'll be happy to know that I'm using your idea here, and I hope it will do some good. And then, like you said, people seem to have forgotten about it, outside of Boston and Philly anyway.
Well, even maybe in Boston and Philly, people don't really know the whole story. There's a couple of things about this that are particularly fascinating to me, and one is that this is somebody who's looking into their will and trying to control where their money is going for the next 200 years, which is either a great breadth of vision or a great depth of ego, and I'm not sure, maybe it's both. And the other thing that's interesting, I mean, this is Ben Franklin, but he's not betting on science. He's not betting on education. He's not betting on navigation. I mean, he's the guy who crossed the Atlantic 372 times or something like that. He's betting on tradesmen. So why is he making a 200-year bet on tradesmen, do you think?
It's an excellent question. And I was struck when I read his will that it begins, I, Benjamin Franklin, printer. For all the achievements he had and all the successes he had, he starts with his trade. Franklin is probably the only person who started a college and then chose to exclude said college from their will. When he came back from Paris, he saw the state of the Philadelphia Academy, which is now the University of Pennsylvania, and he was quite chagrined by what had happened to his vision for that school. And he sent an excoriating letter about it to the trustees, saying that when I co-founded this university and I fundraised for it in the 1750s, I wanted this school to be a great leveler. I wanted it to take working class men. Now, Franklin is ahead of his time, but he's very much of his time with several aspects of his life. His school was only for men in the beginning. But he said, I wanted this to be a great leveler, and I wanted it to teach practical skills, accounting, public speaking, good writing, etc. He comes back from Philadelphia, in 1785, and he sees that his academy has basically become a finishing school for the aristocracy. They're teaching Latin and Greek. Oh my gosh, the horrors, right? But he said, you've actually built a wall around this school and are excluding working class people from it. I think also Franklin, had gone through the Constitutional Convention, and realized, whoa, I'm older than everybody here. He was even older by 26 years of George Washington. He could have been most of the delegates' father. And I think he realized too, these aren't the same guys that I grew up with in Philadelphia. This is a different breed of cat. And he vigorously argued at the Constitutional Convention that people who hold public office should not receive salaries. Now, this is a bit rich coming from a man who was, wealthy and could retire at 42. But he said, look, if in England and France, I noticed that people are willing to have a king in exchange for not being ruled by a group of very rich people, the aristocracy. But we are not going to have a king here. And if we're not careful, we're going to be ruled by the aristocracy. And so he felt the way to prevent this was just serve office for free. And this will make people not seek office for personal gain and profit. And he put his money where his mouth is. And he refused to have a salary for the 3 years that he served as president of Pennsylvania, as the governorship was called. And so in his will, he takes that salary that he forsook as president of Pennsylvania, and he takes that money and says, I'm going to use this to stake tradespeople. Because in his will, he said, in my view, good apprentices make the best citizens. They see the tangible result of policy and taxation at the ground level. They work with all classes, creeds, and origins of society at a daily level. And these are the people we want to help get their footing in life. And these are the people we want to enter public government, public service.
So he's saying that this is kind of an essential building block, right? He's doing this not because he wants to be a nice guy, but he sees it as necessary.
Absolutely. On the one hand, he's paying forward the help that he got as a young printer in Philadelphia, where two people approached him and said, your partner's a bit of a dipsomaniac and we want to buy him out. And so you can start your own business. So he says in the will, the foundation of my fortune was when I came to Philly, these two guys helped me start my own print shop and stand on my own 2 feet. I want to pay forward their help to other young apprentices. At the same time, right, he's saying it's essential to the foundation, to the survival of the Republic, that we have this class of people involved in government. But you're right, it's really a delusion of grandeur in a way, right? This is the demise of the United States seemed more, likely than its success at the time he's writing this. The dollar isn't even official currency for 2 years after his passing.
Yeah, it's quite a leap forward. We're going to talk about, somebody said, I wonder what happened to the money. We're going to talk about what happened to the money. And it's a very interesting story. One could write a book about it. And one of the three of us did. But before we get on to that, I want to just talk about, Ben Franklin dies on page 1 of your book. I don't want to give too much away. Technically it's page.
Spoiler
it's
alert.
the first page of the book. Yeah. Now, what I thought was interesting is that Franklin's one of the best-known people of the age. He's revered on both sides of the ocean. He's involved in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. So I would have thought when he died, there would be this massive outpouring of tributes from the leading figures of the day. But you refer in your subtitle to his death as divisive. And reading your book, I would say that it's greeted with more than a little bit of sang-froid, right? A little bit of a chill on the part of his fellow founders. Why is that?
That's funny. I want to just point out a great book design here. These black bars across his face are to show that his sad eyes, it's a different way of looking at him. Everyone knows how doleful he looks when he sat for this portrait in France. But these black bars also refer to the 3 acts of the book, but also to the badges of mourning that people would have worn when someone passed away in the 17th and late 18th century. And you're right. When he passes away, Congress votes to wear badges of mourning. They'll wear the black armband. But the Senate, led by Vice President John Adams and George Washington, refused to mourn Franklin in this way. Washington said that if Franklin did not die in office, he did not die on the battlefield. If we start this tradition now, who knows where it will end? And Franklin admired Washington a great deal. In fact, if you walk into the Smithsonian Museum of American History in D.C., one of the first things you'll see when you walk in is Franklin's walking stick, which he gave to Washington in his will. Washington refused to wear the badges of mourning. There was no state funeral. That surprised me. The first state funeral was actually for Washington 9 years later when he passes in 1799. Franklin had fallen out with a lot of his fellow founders. You're right. And a part of this is when he comes back from Paris, he's quite cranky and he feels like he's out of the loop. He wants to be recompensed for his grocer's bills and wine merchant bills.
Don't we all?
Yeah, exactly. In Paris. And he's being frozen out. They're not doing it. He also is upset that John Jay and other ministers were given land grants for their service, and he was not. I think the founders, a lot of the Constitutional Convention delegates and other founders saw him as being cosseted and adored by the French when they, the nascent Federalist Party, wanted America more closely allied with their imperial cousins, the British, right? They wanted to go back to that trade agreement and that cultural tie. And so at the same time, the French Revolution is beginning, and many would-be Federalists, as this party is rising, are saying, look, these are Franklin's mobs. Franklin wanted a unicameral legislature. He believed in direct democracy. This is what you get if you have that. And so while the French are the ones who are mourning him with great celebrations, and it's in the book I talk about the weeks of eulogies and encomiums and parties and toasts for Franklin's memory. When the French put all those things in an envelope and send it back to President Washington, Washington refuses to open the envelope, and Adams refuses to read those tributes out loud in the Senate. And there's a faction in the states who are miffed at this, right? That especially the Pennsylvania factions, the senators and the Congress people are saying, what is going on? We need to mourn Franklin officially here. And they're circumventing Thomas Jefferson and the State Department and writing their own letters of gratitude back to Paris. Meanwhile, Franklin's eulogy isn't read in America until nearly 11 months after he died. And then it's read by his mortal enemy, a man he loathed. And in this guy's eulogy, I don't want to give too much away, but of all of Franklin's inventions he could have cited and praised him for, the only invention this guy mentions is that Franklin invented the fireplace flue.
Well, that is,
It's very important.
We all remember that from high school history. Right?
Can I follow up on that one, Chris, and then I'll give the floor over. But I want to say that, first of all, two things. One is that somebody asked me the other day, they're talking about the state of the world now, which we don't really deal with on this show, but they said, were people divided over such ridiculous little things 200 years ago as they are now? Yes, I said. I hope they're watching, because we're hearing that now. And speaking of one more cause, I think we have to add some jealousy in there of Ben Franklin. And I'm looking at you, John Adams, and this great quote, which is in your book, and I hope I can get it there over the police siren. that Adams writes to a friend when Franklin is dying. Should I keep trying to do this, or should I wait for
New
the
York.
siren? Okay. He says, the history of our republic will be one continued lie from one end to the other. And the essence of the whole thing will be that Dr. Franklin's electrical rod smote the earth and out sprang General Washington. That Franklin electrified him with his rod, and thenceforward those two conducted all the policy negotiations, legislation, and war. I do think he's a little jealous.
He is, and I love how that letter continues. It's funny you say this is one of my favorite, as a writer, listen to me, it's like it's not my own book. It's one of my favorite parts of the book, but I was really excited.
It's okay. It's okay. We appreciate enthusiasm.
I'm so detached from it. No, I want to get it right because I was so excited to find this letter and to continue it, because Adams, what's funny about Adams is he's a really complicated guy, right? He comes off as a crank, but he's a very interesting person, and he's a lawyer. And his first great case was he defended the redcoats that shot down Crispus Attucks, and other people in Boston, the Boston Massacre. But Adams continues this quote that, look, if this letter should be preserved and read 100 years hence, the reader will say, the envy of this John Adams could not bear to think of the truth. But this, my friend, to be serious, is the fate of all ages and nations. No nation can adore more than one man at a time. But 13 days later, Franklin dies, and he's not that man.
Yeah. So I know I want to get into this a bit. And I know we'll talk about the various phases of this story, but what happens in the immediate aftermath of his death with his bet? I mean, what's the reaction to it? Does it go as he plans? How does it start? This story, part of the story, kind of get going.
He played off Boston and Philly's rivalry, which was really smart. In his will, he said, if one of you doesn't accept this money, the other city gets all of it, and they get to run the loan scheme. And so Boston at this time, is the center of religion and learning in the United States.
The universe. It's the hub of the universe.
Although it's funny because Philly would have argued, no, we are, because we're the poor. Boston is homogenous largely. Philly is very diverse. It's the biggest port. New York at that time was still right. It had become the capital, but Broadway was still a cattle trail. So where you're sitting right now, Rick, would have been pastures and so forth. But Philly, was the center of finance. It was the center of publishing, and it became the capital quite shortly afterwards. So as they begin right away, Franklin says, look, you each have to step forward and take the money, and you have to manage it for free. You can't use any of my bequests for overhead. And so he's challenging, who's going to do better with this, right? In the beginning, it goes gangbusters. The first decade, things are flying because it's fun to open. You can see the ledgers at the Boston City Archives and also at the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia. And when you turn it, it's got that red rot, the pages sort of crinkled when it comes off, the rust of books. And you see this village start to assemble before your eyes because the first recipients were saddlers, candle makers, glaziers, boot makers, hairdressers, masons, house builders. And Franklin wanted to make sure that the principal kept accruing. And so he said, if you take a loan out, you have to have two sureties, two guarantors to back the loan. And in the Boston ledgers, you see names as guarantors, including Paul Revere, Sam Adams, backing these people who were taking these loans out. So it starts out really great for the first decade. But Franklin did not factor in, again, he was a lot of foresight, but he didn't see things coming, including the Industrial Revolution, let alone the War of 1812, let alone something like the Erie Canal, which is going to deny Philadelphia its status as the great port. And so as you turn the pages, and when I started this, I was rooting for these guys to pay all the money back, like year 1, year 2, year 3. I hope you get it. Let's see what happens to you. And in the beginning, again, a lot of these tradespeople are fulfilling Franklin's idea. One of the first recipients becomes the 4th mayor of Boston. And he's elected, says an historian, as a protest against the way the upper classes were ruling the city. A Philadelphia tradesman named Liberty Brown, born on the 4th of July. What a great name, Liberty Brown. He's a silversmith. He becomes head of the Philadelphia City Council, which is an incredibly important position at that time. Another guy becomes a judge out in the Indiana Territory, lives in Franklin County. speaks vociferously in Congress after he's elected as a representative against the Indian Removal Act. So in the beginnings, it's really going great. But again, the economy begins to change and America begins to change. And that's when you see a turn.
So let's jump ahead, and we're not gonna give away everything, but I think we can jump ahead a little bit to the 100-year mark, because amazingly, I think amazingly, it's still a thing. It hasn't all fallen apart in 100 years, but maybe it's deviated a little from Franklin's vision. And who's doing better at that, Boston or Philadelphia? Keeping in mind that both Chris and I are from Boston.
And
I mean, Chris is a native.
we're not
of Boston.
biased at all. Yeah.
I only lived there 35 years,
John
but
Adams
still.
thing, I gotta tread lightly here.
Well, you're already right. John Adams, and also you referred to the Boston Massacre. I'm sure that Chris would have wanted you to refer to it as the incident on King Street,
Yes.
but the unfortunate event. But anyway.
After the first 100 years, Boston is clearly ahead. And it's funny because the newspapers at the time really did report the tally as if it were a baseball game between the Bean Eaters and the Quakers, who were the two at that time. It's funny because there's a huge division that happens with the way Boston and Philadelphia manage their money, and it has to do with the economies of the city. When Lowell opens his textile mills on the Charles River and creates this vast amount of wealth, there are gentlemen in Boston who start creating new financial institutions to manage this wealth. And so you have the first investment bank, you have the first mutual fund, you have the first trustee. And those gentlemen who take over the management of Franklin's loan scheme say, well, you know what? Up here in Boston, you don't see a lot of silversmiths and bootmakers anymore. Those people are working in the mills now. That's an automated process. And so instead, we should really be focusing on the 100-year and 200-year mark and try to let the money accrue as much as we can. And so Boston pulls way ahead in the money race. Philadelphia, throughout those years, in contrast, has a guy who has apprenticed as a hatter and had he called it a decided distaste for learning. And he was appointed mayor 16 times. Robert Wharton. And so in Philly, they're adhering to, no, let's keep Franklin's vision intact and keep loaning the money out to tradespeople. And again, Franklin never foresaw that someone might default or he didn't think someone would ever, or their sureties would default on the loans, but there were quite a few defaults. And so Philly falls behind in the money race. So when we get to the 100-year mark, Boston has about 4 times as much money in the pot as Philly does. And then the debate begins. How do we spend it? And I have to imagine Franklin, after going through the Constitutional Convention in which no one could agree on anything, was probably smiling to himself when he said, hey, 100 years from now, I want you lot to get into a room and figure out, what are you going to do? How are you going to decide how to spend the money?
Well, like one of the things I was curious about, and I want to relate this to a personality, but clearly in the case of Boston, anyway, they're really kind of diverting themselves from Franklin's intent.
Yes.
And I wonder, as that transition is happening, are there any tradespeople in Boston or any working Bostonians saying, hey, wait a minute, who are you to say this is how we're going to spend the money? Was there any fight to that?
There are. The money was oversaw for almost 60 years by a man named William Minot. And you Bostonians probably know this name. If you don't, you've been to Copley Square and you know that there's a building height restriction around the square. That came into effect because the Minots controlled a lot of the buildings around the square and wanted to keep their rents high and said, we need sunlight on the square. And so we're going to have this height restriction around it. And they were early benefactors of the Museum of Fine Arts and other things too. But at one point they controlled individually over 1% of the total tax revenue of Boston. They were incredibly wealthy. So William Minot, controlled the money for over 60 years, and people didn't really question him. He was the son of an august judge who had delivered George Washington's, eulogy in public, and ran the money. American airline pilots sort of have that Chuck Yeager drawl when they come on. Hey, folks, and I think William Minot is the model for a trustee, that you keep your lips sealed, you manage the money as if it's your own child. You do what's best for the money rather than maybe the benefactor's intent. So by the time the 1860s roll around, a new man comes in after Minot retires and then passes away, named Samuel Mccleary. And he's a big character in the book because Mccleary had received a Franklin Award when he went to the Boston Latin School. Mccleary grew up in the shadow of Bunker Hill, and Mccleary was the man who raised funds for the Crispus Attucks Monument on the Common. And he was very much a Bostonian through and through. And Mccleary loved Franklin. And he said, I want to get this money back into circulation. And so when it gets to the centennial mark and the city is debating what to do with it, Mccleary is the guy behind the scenes saying, we really need to do something to benefit tradespeople here in Boston, which is why eventually they came in Boston to agree to build a trade school, which I love. This is very Boston to me. You guys tell me if I'm wrong. But when the city finally agreed, let's build a trade school, the city treasurer said, nope, I'm not releasing the money because you're saddling the citizens of Boston with a debt, because this is supposed to be a one-time gift. And if you build a school, we have to spend money every year to maintain it. And so I refused to let go of it. And thus began a big battle between the city council and its own government and the Franklin trustees to try to get something built with the money.
I love that at one point there's a lawsuit where the mayor, is it the mayor of Boston, is on both sides of the lawsuit. He's in the suing party and he's in the sued party. And as you say, he wins because, of course, how could he not win? He's on both sides.
But it wasn't the victory he wanted. That's the greatest part of it. It's like he won, but he didn't get control of the money, which is what he wanted, right?
But and eventually, eventually these. Kathy Hurst has a mention in the comments here, kind of jumping ahead as to what happens. But eventually, they Henry Pritchett gets, who's the president of MIT, gets involved, and he's a trustee, and he's involved in other ways. And they get Andrew Carnegie involved, and eventually put something together in Boston that is still there today, right?
Yeah, Carnegie was a fascinating person to me too, because I think when I think American philanthropy, I think it starts with Carnegie. You think with Peabody or Rockefeller or Carnegie, these great industrialists. But Carnegie, knew that Franklin's favorite invention was the matching grant. Franklin created this to raise the Pennsylvania Hospital. And Carnegie, when he gets wind, Pritchett goes to visit him in Skibo Castle in Scotland. And Carnegie, with great flourish, according to Pritchett, says, I'll match Ben Franklin. I'll make this happen. I'll provide the same amount of money so we can build the school, and my fund will maintain it throughout its annual expenses. And Carnegie fascinated me because he's very much a latter-day Franklin, right? He's also born a British subject. His father is a casualty of the Industrial Revolution. He comes over to Boston. He was a skilled dyer. He comes to New York. And like Franklin himself, he immigrates to Pennsylvania and becomes quite wealthy on the back of mastering the technology of the day. Franklin masters the printing press. Carnegie masters the telegraph. Franklin, of course, funds libraries. Carnegie loves this idea. Franklin writes The Way to Wealth. Carnegie writes The Gospel of Wealth. And when you read his autobiography, you can see Carnegie models his memoir after Franklin's. The structure is very much the same. And Carnegie, he gave this great speech at the centennial of Franklin's death in Philadelphia, where they have 3 days of parties and celebrations and so forth and gun salutes. And Carnegie finally takes the stage on the 3rd day and says, look, I want to talk about something that no one here has talked about, and that's Franklin's philanthropy. And when I was a young man in Scotland and I was told to study the Bible, I instead took my theology from Franklin. And then we should all use Franklin as our example, that the way to do good to God, or the best way to serve God, is to do good to man on earth. And so, Franklin declares to this audience that my teacher is Benjamin Franklin, and that's who I got my ideas of philanthropy from. And so it's only fitting that Carnegie rescues Boston's fund and builds the trade school. But then there's a big fight because Carnegie, as you all know, loved to slap his name on his philanthropy and his philanthropic projects. And Franklin refused to do that. Franklin said, if you put your name on something, it will dissuade other people from donating to it because they think they're giving greater good to you rather than the project. And so there's a long fight too, where the president of Harvard, Charles Eliot, in the press rebukes Carnegie and says, don't you dare put your name on this school. So to this day, it's the Benjamin Franklin Institute of Technology, but there's a twist, Because right now in Boston, there's a public comment period open. A family recently gave a $12.5 million gift to the school, and the condition of the gift is to add their name to the school itself.
Oh.
So history is repeating itself. And yes, they sent them a copy of the book saying, so, pump your brakes. Maybe don't do this. Yeah.
Right. What kind of response did you get to that?
Zero, nothing. It's $12 million for you. Flip me right off.
So, given kind of Franklin's founding, as you say, a catalyst of modern American philanthropy, what would you say would be the differences between Franklin's view of philanthropy versus Carnegie's and what philanthropy is today? I mean, would Franklin recognize it, or is it?
That's a great question. I think Franklin would be shocked that more Americans work in non-governmental organizations than they do in manufacturing. But I think he wouldn't be surprised that Americans are still, per capita, the most generous people on the earth. And Franklin observed in his memoir that those with the least often give the most. And that's still true today. As far as percentage of income, those with lower incomes give a higher percentage of their money to charities and causes. So Franklin would probably be really happy about that. But I think he would be shocked that by and large, when Americans today, think of philanthropy, we think of those bleached teeth photos, with the sleeves rolled up, of a very trim and fit rich person endowing a chair or an ottoman or whatever it is at a university, giving millions of dollars, when in fact most American philanthropy and charity is given in increments of $5 and $10 and $20 and $30 and $100, right? So Franklin would probably be shocked at why is it that our attention is often given to these massive gifts, and why is it that now philanthropy in America is often a sort of self-advertisement, right? That's a big change from what he did in his time.
That's a very interesting point, and I want to just reiterate kind of what you said as somebody who's done fundraising for my documentary film. What was it about, Chris? It was about the Ghost Army. Yes.
Okay. I'm glad you reminded me. Sorry about that.
But one of the first things I learned, because everybody's thinking, I'm going to get a grant from the National Endowment for the Humanities, or I'm going to get a grant from somebody. And they said 95% of all philanthropy is from individuals, and a lot of it is small dollars. So if you really want to raise money, you have to kind of go after the volume. And I also recalled a great quote from Danny Thomas when he was raising money for St. Jude Children's Hospital. He said, I'd rather have 1 million people give $1 each than one person give $1 million, because then I have 1 million friends. And also 1 million repeat donors, I might add to that. So I think Ben Franklin's right on here.
He says this, in his memoir too, that if you hide yourself behind the scheme, put the scheme front, more people are going to want to donate to it. He also realized, though, that sometimes it benefits one to publish, to put out the names of people giving, because it can sort of shame other people to be like, whoa, so-and-so gave $1,000. Well, I make more than they. I'll show them. I'll put $2,000 in, right? But by and large, he felt really strongly, like what you just said, the Danny Thomas quote, that's a modern day embodiment of this, that you get farther if you have people giving small amounts and then you keep them on their mailing list and you have them subscribe every year. And I have to say that this really changed my approach to giving, because I think, like a lot of us, I listen to public radio or I watch public television and I hear the pledge drives and I think, but I can't do that $500 matching grant they're pitching right now for the tote bag. It doesn't matter. It's $20. It's $25. Everything goes a long way. And Rick, I used to, when I lived in New York, I'd walk over to the Met on Sundays and sit in that wonderful atrium with the newspaper and have coffee and look out the windows to the park. And I always felt really bad about not paying to enter or only paying $1, right? But the head of the museum at the time had told me, like, we'll take anything we can get. Don't feel bad at all. $1, a $5 thing, it really, really adds up. Just give what you can. Give a little every time.
One of the things that really kind of surprised me in the book, and I'd like to hear your thoughts about, was the frequent opposition of the labor movement.
Yeah.
That just totally shocked me. Why would they be opposed to wanting to create an apprentice system to train more workers?
Because it would dilute their wages. The idea was that if you create a trade school and you train 100 young people to come in and know how to weld or know how to saw wood or know how to hang doors or install windows, that's going to lower our own wages because there'll be that many more people competing for our jobs. Or even more so in the case of public hearings in Boston, the labor leaders would say, what Franklin wants to do here is create people, train people, and then they go create their own businesses. We don't want that to happen. We want to train people ourselves and enroll them in the union so we can help place them in jobs, right? And this goes all the way through the present day. I think I was shocked. I don't really think about the apprenticeship system much in the United States anymore because you don't hear about it. But my folks are in construction. This is probably one of the reasons I was drawn to the will and to this idea. My mom can read blueprints and price jobs. I can't. I'm the dumb one in our family. I'm just the guy who teaches Moby Dick. But I was shocked to learn, in the States, there's 17 million people enrolled in 4-year degree programs, but there's only 600 some thousand enrolled in apprenticeship programs. And when I talked to people, including my mother, they said, well, one of the reasons for that is in America today, apprenticeship systems are run under the aegis of the Department of Education. And so there's a lot of red tape involved, and unions themselves aren't always happy with the way apprenticeship programs are run. And so instead you see things like where I'm from in Pittsburgh, local union halls like the Carpenters Union and so forth, the steam fitters, they have their own training programs that are run outside those formal, Department of Education apprenticeship systems.
But that's not what Franklin intended, though.
Not at all. Not at all.
Yeah.
It's funny. I
Was
write
he naive?
Well, I write in the book about, is he pro-union or not? Would he have enjoyed this sort of idea or not? And at the end of the day, I think he sides with management a lot in his writings and his view as a business owner. I mean, even Adam Smith in his book talks about that workers should have a right to collectively organize and demand higher wages. But Franklin, it's a different economy, of course, but Franklin is very much against a minimum wage. He says the market should determine everything. But then, of course, he has this transition later in his life when he becomes our greatest patriot and he realizes there is, in fact, power in a union. But as far as labor goes, I think Franklin's idea was really like, to every person unto themselves. Our idea should be the independent farmer over there and the independent, horseshoe foundry over here. And you should be your own boss, and you shouldn't worry about collective organization. You should just mind your own business, literally. I mean, when he made the first penny, the first coin in the United States, it literally on the back said, mind your business, meaning not keep it yourself, but just do your own work, right? Yeah. Keep your head down and do your work.
Do your job, right?
Do your job. Do your job. You're from Boston.
Yeah, do your job. There's so many things I want to ask about, but one of the things that you said in your book, and it kind of ties into what you're just talking about, is that each generation kind of rediscovers Ben Franklin and reinterprets him. So you were saying, well, what would Ben Franklin think today of unions? But it's sort of like in every generation, there's people grabbing onto something of Ben Franklin to say, this is so correct, or this is why he's awful. I was really kind of surprised by that.
I came to see him as a painting, a work of art, right? I didn't realize this until I was reading the book, or writing the book, excuse me, reading it. I read it as I wrote it.
Did you read it too? Because it's good. You should.
The Mona Lisa, the Mona Lisa wasn't considered a masterpiece until it was stolen in the early 20th century. And so I realized, with Franklin, this is true too. He doesn't change. He, as a painting, let's say, doesn't change. But how every generation views it changes, right? And that you see things you admire in it and you put it in context for how it's different based on the other paintings of that time. You also see how it kicks off the evolution of other forms of art, but then you also see the flaws in it as well. That it is true in the book. I use this refrain that every generation discovers Franklin for themselves, because he is propped up at different moments in American history as an exemplar of something, of the times, or as don't do what Franklin did, right? Look what he did. Although he was a founder, he was very duplicitous about the slave trade, and he himself held slaves, that he called them servants that worked in his print shop, for example. Only late in life did he convert to the cause of abolitionism. And so, throughout the Civil War, for example, he was propped up as, look, Franklin was this. Oh, no, he wasn't. He changed his mind. He was this. When we get to the Great Depression, Franklin is all of a sudden, lifted up as the paragon of thrift, and all of a sudden he becomes this sort of conservative emblem, this guy who had an illegitimate son and, had a common law marriage, not even a formal marriage in a church, wasn't a Christian, was very much a deist, along with a lot of Enlightenment thinkers. But all of a sudden he's being propped up as like, he's our model for conservatism. And meanwhile, F. Scott Fitzgerald at the end of The Great Gatsby is saying, you know, at Gatsby's funeral, Gatsby's dad is showing Nick like, oh, my son, when he was a boy, he followed this Franklinian plan, you know, for self-improvement, where he'd wake up in the morning and study electricity and needed inventions. And Nick is looking at this like, oh, you know, if you study Franklin as a boy, this is what turns, you know, it's the curse of the American dream. He overreached, right? And then in the 50s and 60s, all of a sudden Franklin is, again, resurrected as, oh, he's this great scientist. And here we are in the space race with the Russians. And we should be looking to Franklin for our tech, you know, our model of technology and STEM teaching and so forth. So he's always brought back up again. And we see it even in this current day. You know, I was both excited to watch the Ken Burns series, but also fearful. I kept thinking, I'm counting down the minutes, right? Like, please don't spend a half hour on his last will and testament. I was so relieved at the end when they just briefly mention it, you know, in one sentence. I was like, oh, this is good. This is part 3 of the documentary that he hasn't made yet. But you're right. We look at him differently. You know, it seems like every 30 or 50 years, Franklin comes around again. It was, oh, didn't think about that with Franklin before until now.
So, you know, this, aside from being fascinating history, the book really caused me to think about kind of what Franklin was trying to do. And from a personal perspective, after one of the many financial crashes, I decided that I was going to do history anymore. I was going to go to the North Bennett Street School and learn how to make furniture. And that's you're probably aware of it. It's a trade school. It's an industry school. I had a great closest thing to an apprenticeship you're going to get, and largely due to my own inability to cut a straight dovetail. I'm not an independent furniture maker. But there seems to be this notion comes through all through America of, like, you know, the individual, and he can make it on his own. And there's talk now all this time about how we need people in the trades. Yep. And we idolize this idea, but we do seem to do very little to nurture it. And that's what I found so fascinating, again, from a personal perspective, about your book. And why do you think that is? I mean, we have this idea, but we do nothing to kind of bring it along.
I'm curious what viewers think of this. I mean, I think a lot of us, if we had shop class back when they used to offer shop, it was always the sort of shorthand joke class, right? That, oh, right, don't cut your finger off. And the shop teacher had his, you know, little bottle behind the desk and all that stuff. And it's really a shame. You know, I think if we taught kids at a younger age that this matters and that you can do these things, and it's not that hard to learn them, frankly. I mean, cutting definitely is. I'm with you on this. And I can't solder a joint, and I'm not going to pretend to know anything about this. I really am just the English professor, much to my mother's chagrin. But you know, even coming up in high school right now, or going, you know, looking at colleges, how many high school guidance counselors talk to young people and say, hey, you know, if you learn how to install Windows, you can make $200 to $300 a pop, set your own schedule, and you can make a 6-figure income. And you don't even have to work in the winter if you don't want to. You can listen to the radio and do whatever you want, you know, while you work. I don't think people even talk about it as a viable career or are aware of how much you can earn. Yeah.
It's just more people should read your book and learn about Franklin.
It's true. My mom would say, you know, it's really difficult now. Here we go. The old guy's talking about young people. It really is hard.
You're not even the old guy in this conversation. I'm so sorry.
It's hard to explain to people, like, you know, this is better for you than driving Uber or playing competitive video games, right? And when I would hang out at the Franklin Trade School in Boston there in the South End, the Franklin Institute of Technology, the president of the school at the time would tell me, like, I'm telling these kids when they come and enroll here, like, you cannot afford not to do this. Why are you working two jobs? Why are you working shifts for employers that aren't paying you basic benefits or a pension? You know, I'm training you to rise up to be part of the middle class. And he told me, it was funny, there were saws buzzing and there was a 3D printer going, it was really loud. And he said, you know, these days in America, like, educating lower class people to become part of the middle class is obviously now a revolutionary act, right? He said, like, but if I were to say to you, like, come get a 4-year degree and sign here and take on all this debt, you're somehow considered a hero for getting someone enrolled in college. Whereas my trade school over here is struggling to find people to enroll. You know, Harvard across the Charles has a $50 billion endowment. And we're over here trying to make our electricity bill. It doesn't really compute, you know?
Yeah, I mean, as one of our viewers says, it's kind of the prevailing attitude that is, if you don't go to college, you know, there must be something wrong with you. You must be kind of, you know, not really with it. Whereas is really, it's not the end all be all.
No, and over half of America, look, 2/3 of Americans do not have 4-year degrees right now, and over half of us identify as working class. Less than 2% of Congress people will self-report ever having had a working class job. And so I think there is, I'm not going to blame DC for everything. We're not going to do that podcast.
Oh, go for it. Go for it.
But there is a real disconnect. And when you look at, when you watch TV at night and you see the people who are on your screen, they often have titles after their names. Credentialism is a real thing. If someone's a PhD or someone has this degree or someone has this position, and we don't see people on television that maybe would convince a young person, hey, maybe I should try this. And I love this part. I don't want to spoil the ending, but I love that, when you get to the end of this book, you'll find that Franklin's money is still alive. And in Philadelphia, you can go on the Philadelphia Foundation website and click down to the Benjamin Franklin Fund, and you can kick in $5 or $10 if you want to mix your money in with Franklin's money. Because in Philadelphia, if you don't want to do a 4-year degree, if you're an 18-year-old who wants to learn a trade or a craft or become an artisan, they've expanded the definition, you can get a Franklin grant to go and learn to do those things. So I love that it's still there. In Boston, you can walk into the school and see his money in use. And they're building a big new campus for the Institute in Boston. They're building a brand new school in Roxbury, which is going to be completely modern, for the next century. And in Philadelphia, you can still apply for Franklin's money to learn a trade too. So it's still there. And I hope the book encourages people. Who knows, right? As a writer, you always just want your book to change one person's mind. Maybe it will encourage someone to take up Franklin's challenge and learn something useful. Not just Moby Dick.
Call me Ishmael, but I think that's a good sentiment and a good sentiment to end on. So I'm going to say that Michael Meyer, thank you so much for joining us at 4:00 in the morning. It's almost 5. Soon the cocks will begin to crow in Taipei, and you won't be able to get back to sleep. But we should mention, if we haven't already, enough times, that your book is Benjamin Franklin's Last Bet. It's by Michael Meyer. It's good, it's fun, and you do learn all sorts of things. And I'll just a little Easter egg in there is really frightening what happens to Ben Franklin's papers.
Yes.
OMG, that gave me shivers.
OMG.
And OMG and not LOL. Okay, I mean it was that gave me shivers. That was a terrifying thing. But buy the book and then you can read about it and find out about it.
It's a fascinating book, guys. It really is.
Michael, thank you so much again for joining us, and you take care.
Thanks, Chris and Rick. Thanks everybody for watching.
Thank you.
All right,
Bye.
cheers.
Bye bye.
Wow, and I've remembered the buttons here to push. And I was thinking about, when Michael was talking about all the, the individual donors, and you want to list the donors, and you want to say who the supporters are, so other people will support. And so, Michael, I know you're still watching. Michael, you hang on. We will say goodbye to you properly after we get off the air. But we do appreciate our top shelf patrons.
Should we like to have Franklin's name in there somehow?
We can. Do we have any? But we don't have Franklin, but we have a space between Stephen Ferber and John Gallagher. If anybody named Franklin wants to donate, or if anyone wants to donate, and we'll put you down as Ben Franklin.
Yeah, we'll call you anything you want to be called
on there. But we do appreciate all our Patreon donors, including our top shelf patrons listed here, and all the other Patreon supporters. And we appreciate you guys being here. And Chris, if you liked what you saw, well, actually, I know, Chris, you liked what you saw, but if our viewers, if they liked what they saw today, and why wouldn't they, we hope you'll please like us on Facebook or subscribe if you're on YouTube, because Chris is desperate for the attention and the praise, and I just want to help this guy out with that. Okay?
I've got a problem.
You do. And next week, Chris, the Nazis also adopted Ben Franklin at one point. That's in Michael's book, how they took some fake Ben Franklin news to use it to their own purposes. But next week, our topic and episode 100 of History Happy Hour.
This is only going to go on for a few weeks, right?
Nazi billionaires. Dynasties of the Third Reich, the dark history of Germany's wealthiest dynasties. David de Jong, as lighthearted and positive as today's show was, I'm thinking we're going in a different direction a week from now. But still, should be fun. And we're delighted to be back in our respective countries and doing this and carrying on and having fun. And we just appreciate everybody joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Happy Easter.
And
stay safe.